Meeting of the Federal Communication Commission's Open Internet Advisory Committee to order. My name is Jonathan Zittrain. I am chairing the committee along with David Clark, my colleague, who is here. And I thought it would be great to start by simply going down the line here and doing some brief introductions from folks as we just go down the line. So Marcus, should we start with you?
Okay, I'm Marcus Weldon. I'm the CTO for Alcatel-Lucent, a vendor of networking equipment.
I'm Shane Greenstein. I'm a professor here at Northwestern.
And I'm Kevin McIlerney, and I'm Senior Vice President of Network Engineering for Comcast.
Tejas Narachenya, Special Counsel at the FCC and the Designated Federal Officer.
David Clark from the Computer Science Lab at MIT.
Chip Sharp, I'm the Director of Technology Policy at Cisco Systems.
Alyssa Cooper, I'm the Chief Computer Scientist at the Center for Democracy and Technology.
And Dennis Roberson, the Vice Provost for Research at Illinois Institute of Technology.
Chuck Kalmanek, Vice President of Research at AT&T Labs.
Jen Rexford, Professor of Computer Science at Princeton.
Charles Slocum, Assistant Executive Director at the Writers Guild of America.
Matt Murphy, and I'm here on behalf of the Walt Disney Company.
Leslie Daigle, Internet Society.
Great, and with luck we have Brad, Jessica, and Michelle by dial-in. Are you folks there?
I'm here. Jessica's here.
Okay, so I heard.
Burnham is also here.
And Michelle, are you there?
I am.
All right, we have a full quorum. So, and I don't know if we outnumber the public. Here in sunny Chicago, we do, at least within the confines of the room, but we are also webcast live, and this will be archived forever, so you're all on notice. And we have a busy agenda today, so we should just get straight to it. And with that, we will start with the working group check-ins, and by around 11:30, we'll be able to take public comment, should there be any. So why don't we start with Jennifer Rexford, who chairs the working group for mobile broadband.
Great, thank you. And I think a copy of my slides are being emailed to you. Great, so our working group in the first 6 months after the group was formed did a fairly specific case study on one particular incident on the relationship between AT&T and FaceTime, and looked at issues particularly around topics that are in the open internet order around transparency, blocking, and traffic discrimination. And after that, we felt it was a good idea to kind of pull back and look much more broadly at the overall mobile broadband ecosystem because it differs so much from the wired space, and also to have a broader view of what we're looking at in terms of openness, to include broadly anything that helps incentivize investment and innovation in the mobile broadband space, and to look towards longer-term trends and principles. And so what I'm going to describe here is a little bit of a work in progress from our group on analyzing the interactions between the parties in the mobile broadband ecosystem, and 5 sort of mini case studies we've been doing to elucidate some issues that arise there. So as you can imagine, there is a natural virtuous cycle at play in the ecosystem where the building of reliable and fast networks encourages the creation of mobile devices that attach to those networks, which in turn incentivizes the creation of applications that offer value to users, who in turn encourage further investment in the network. And to some extent that's true, but the picture is a bit more complicated with at least 5 main parties involved besides the users. The application developers that run on top of operating systems developed by OS developers, that run on top of devices developed by device manufacturers, that connect to network equipment created by network equipment vendors and operated by mobile carriers. And if you just look at each of those 5 different parts of the ecosystem, all except the application space, which is quite rich and diverse, have a relatively small number of players, anywhere from sort of 2 main players to 3 or 4, depending on which one you look at. And so there is a certain amount of competition within each of these categories and a certain amount of competitive cooperation across them. But it's worth noting that there's a relatively small number of dominant players in each of these spaces, and they each have fairly complex relationships with one another. So just to look at some of the forces at play, if you just look at users as an example, users interact with OS developers and device manufacturers primarily in terms of brand identity. So one thing that's particularly interesting in the mobile space compared to the fixed space is that there's really an identification of users with their device and the OS, which are largely inseparable. And there's also a certain amount of learning curve that keeps people from switching from one to the other. And the decisions made by both the OS developer and the device manufacturer affect a lot of things like form factor and battery lifetime and so on. They also connect with the carriers, and that determines in great detail what kind of product definition they have, contract terms, and pricing plans. And then they get most of their perceived value from the apps that are running on top of the platform. And those apps also have influence on things like network and battery usage. If you flip around to the point of view of the application developer, they're under a certain amount of pressures as well. The device manufacturers and the OS developers determine what APIs they have access to develop those applications. And the App Store model is the dominant way that those applications are actually sold to users. The carriers matter in terms of what kind of coverage and performance they offer to let those applications run well, and in some cases may impose restrictions that make it hard for those applications to run. In this space in particular, because there are just so many apps, there's a huge amount of competition, and so users have a great deal of choice. Although on the flip side, users also play a big role in promotion, and the network effect tends to mean that applications can go viral. Going a little further, if you look at the device manufacturers, they're under a certain amount of pressure. In some cases, they're directly the same party as the OS developer, as is the case with the iPhone and iPad. In other cases, they may be subject to certain licensing agreements from the OS manufacturer, and I'll come back to that. They're reliant on the mobile carriers for the distribution of subsidized handsets to users, and may be subject to the carrier's restrictions that lock devices to use with a particular carrier. And again, as I mentioned, the customers directly identify with their device, so that's actually a positive thing where the users identify with the device, although it may make it hard for new entrants to get into the picture because users may already have brand loyalty with a particular device. Looking at the carriers, there are a lot of factors at play here. They interact with the OS developers who now have much more control over the user experience than in the past, again, because the user identifies with that platform more so than perhaps with the mobile carrier they have. The applications are providing the perceived value and yet also are another source of customer spend that competes with the carriers, the spend for the carrier, as well as producing a lot of resource usage on the carrier's network, including both bandwidth and signaling load. Device manufacturers, there's a lot of spend on device subsidies, and also they're the conduit for retail sales and testing and technical support for users who get their device most often directly through the carrier. Equipment vendors become another source of spend and also determine what available features are there, which determine in part what management practices are available for managing traffic. And then users, of course, are the customers, but again, because they have a lot of identity with their device, more so than with the carrier, there may be a greater ease of changing providers. And many of these carriers also offer more traditional fixed services that are quickly being cord-cutted, meaning that often that revenue source has declined quite a bit. And then finally, just to look real briefly at equipment vendors, they really interact primarily directly with the carriers and not so much with the users and app developers and OS developers. But there is a sort of competition or competitive cooperation with device manufacturers around standards for radio access networks and interoperability of equipment and competition for carrier spend between device subsidies and the network equipment. So with that in mind, we're looking at a handful of little case studies to try to look at individual pairs of these parties and how they interact with one another and what the implications could be for openness of the ecosystem. And these are the 5 we're going to take a quick look at. Each of these are still themselves a work in progress, and I'm hoping we can have quite a bit of time for discussion of them. So just to look at the App Store model, which is sort of the dominant way applications are delivered to users, there's a balance here between trust, so that users can trust that the application is legitimate, functionality and the convenience of using the App Store. And the platform provider, like the Apple App Store, will review the applications and will offer a semi-sandboxed environment for running those. But there are a number of policies in these app stores that have a lot of effect on the app developers. Does the app have to be delivered through the App Store, which is the case for Apple iPhone? What kind of screening policies might determine that an app can't get into the App Store? There's revenue sharing agreements. Often 20 to 30% of the revenue for the app actually goes to the App Store. Since there is so much competition in this space for apps, that typically is a significant cut in revenue. And also the way that the App Store chooses to promote or classify different applications influences a lot whether users find out about them in the first place. And there is some interesting longer-term trends here that might enable more web-based applications, particularly HTML5 and WebRTC that we're looking at in more detail too. So that's sort of looking at the tension between app developers and the OS. If you look at between the OS and the device, they're in one case, like in the case of Apple, they're the same party. But if you look at the Android operating system, where there is a separation between the OS and the device, The OS in this case is free and open, but the operating system isn't really the whole story. The access to things like the App Store and search, tech support, early release of new versions of the OS, and et cetera, have a big influence on the handset manufacturers. And so often they have to comply with commercial agreements and agreements for the software development kit that might constrain the way they behave. And in particular, one issue that's been in the news a lot in the past 6 months or so is Google's policies around anti-fragmentation, which for a good reason is concerned about the operating system bifurcating if too many modifications are made to the platform, which would make it hard to be able to support portable apps. But it also in turn makes device manufacturers perhaps somewhat reluctant to experiment with new operating system features, and particularly things that relate to search and navigation, which are constrained in the anti-fragmentation policy. So that's another space where there's some interesting tension at play between the OS and the device. To pick a third one, this is perhaps the most familiar of the ones, is the users' agreements that they have with carriers. So these service agreements and pricing plans dictate, terms of service and offer clarity to customers about what they can expect over, say, an 18-month or 2-year period. And they're a way for carriers to recoup costs and also limit risk by being able to dictate certain terms of a contract ahead of time in a space that's shifting underneath everyone's feet. And then, of course, a lot of different pricing plans have emerged that allow customers to mix and match. But these policies also have terms in them that have influence on openness, including restrictions on device locking, so that a device may not be able to be used with another carrier, and motivated in part because these devices are given to customers with a heavy subsidy by the carrier. Some of the carriers have restrictions on tethering the device or charge extra for tethering, particularly when users have an unlimited data plan where tethering might lead to a sudden increase in traffic load. There may be some restrictions on which apps the user can run under certain pricing plans. And a trend outside the U.S. that may come to the U.S. relatively soon is zero rating, where certain applications or content might be provided outside of the user's usage-based billing or usage cap through agreement with content provider and the carrier. And so that's another topic that'd be interesting to discuss more. Looking at the relationship between the application developer and the carrier, this is a topic we've talked about at a previous meeting, so I'll be brief here, but these applications are often quite aggressive in the way they use the network, often due to naivete of the software developers in terms of the implications of high-level design decisions on the underlying network. Chatty applications can end up wasting signaling resources. Applications that are more aggressive than traditional congestion control protocols can make unfair use of bandwidth compared to other apps. And applications that don't make good use of caching may send duplicate data over the network multiple times. And this is particularly challenging because of the very, very large number of developers and the constantly changing pool of developers. But at least this is a case where incentives between the parties are well aligned in that application developers want their applications to run better, carriers want those applications not to waste resources on the network, and users want the applications not to waste bandwidth and battery lifetime. And so it's more of an education space where having ways for developers to know more about network-friendly application development in the mobile space is sort of already happening. And we've talked last time about AT&T's application resource optimization tool, which is doing exactly that. And finally, we're also looking at a long-term trend towards Wi-Fi offloading and what implications that might have on the market dynamics. Wi-Fi offloading uses unlicensed spectrum, and it's either free or very low cost compared to using cellular. And depending on what study you believe, already 30 to 70% of mobile traffic is already Wi-Fi offloaded. Now, this comes in different flavors with different implications, people having it in their home or office when they're essentially stationary, offered by a business like getting Wi-Fi at Starbucks, and even the emergence of some commercial services like Boingo and Optimum Online that act almost like carriers by offering a fairly large footprint with Wi-Fi connectivity. So this is a good thing. I mean, it's creating more options for consumers. It's providing a way that customers can have cellular for kind of broad coverage and still use Wi-Fi for larger capacity. But this could actually change over time as Wi-Fi coverage gets more significant and as technologies develop to enable more seamless mobility. For example, Hotspot 2.0 will provide ways for users to authenticate automatically to the device, to the access point, and greater support for mobility might make it possible to have a seamless mobile experience that today is only available really with cellular and not with Wi-Fi. So those are the 5 case studies we're looking at, and I just kind of went through them quickly so we have more time available to discuss them. Just to conclude, what we've been discussing in our group is the fact that it's a really complex ecosystem that goes far beyond the relationship between consumers and carriers. and to include app developers, OS developers, device manufacturers, and equipment vendors. And so we have multiple parties that are affecting incentives for other parties in the system to invest in innovation and deployment of new network capacity. And so we think of this broader understanding is really important in thinking about longer-term policy for this space. So what we want to do next is complete these case studies I mentioned and perhaps take on additional ones if, based on discussions we have here, and then step back at the end to hopefully identify a set of principles based on what we've learned there. Two that are sort of natural already are greater transparency to enable greater visibility into network conditions and greater visibility for users to make decisions, and network-friendly applications, which are clearly a win-win for everybody. And then finally, identify if there are any particular concerns in this space where any one part of this ecosystem can or in the future might have an undue influence on the ability of others in the space to innovate. So that's it. Be happy for us to have some discussion.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Why don't we see if there are questions from the committee? David, but you need to be mic'd up to ask your question.
Yep.
Let the record show that David Clark is off camera.
Well, I'm within range of somebody. Anyway, I guess when I looked at the 5 case studies, the thing I couldn't articulate quickly was from the particular perspective of the FCC, which has regulatory obligations, but is not, in a broad sense, concerned with sort of creating marketplaces or something. Which of these do you see as being most likely to reveal an issue that the FCC may have to speak to over the next some period of time? I couldn't really tell.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think our goal here wasn't our primary goal. I think our goal is to understand the larger space, and I think the reason it'd be helpful for the people in the FCC to appreciate that larger space is that they may make, if you make decisions purely from the lens of the consumer's interaction with the carrier, you might be missing factors that are driving the behaviors of each of the parties. So that's sort of think of it as a broad education motivation.
So this might lead to some sort of background analysis or sort of a white paper, tutorial white paper or something like that.
And I think the second thing is the bully pulpit. It's true that the FCC doesn't have purview over all of these things, but to the extent it has relationships with parties who do, there's sort of a bully pulpit opportunity. But I'd be curious, other people in the group, what opinions they have. I mean, that's something we struggle with because we do think this broader view is useful, but its connection to the FCC, it gets a little more tenuous as it gets broader.
Yeah, I'll add something to that, Jen. As we were doing the Wi-Fi offloading one, it became clear that the definition of the term mobile is becoming ambiguous. Because to Jen's example about Hotspot 2.0 and seamless authentication, you will be able to roam from hotspot to hotspot, and as the density of those hotspots goes up, and in certain locations it's already high, you will have a mobile broadband experience that is entirely delivered by Wi-Fi. And so that then creates this interesting question of, you need to look at the sum of cellular and Wi-Fi if you're going to look at the term mobile broadband. It would seem that's a logical thing to look at, because it may be that the consumer is being satisfied by the combination of the two, and looking only at one half of it, you might see some constraints that you weren't happy with, but they're alleviated by the other part. So that was one thing that was beginning to be a topic. Again, I emphasize the beginning because we're just doing the work on this.
Yeah, I would say, just as someone who works for an organization that thinks a lot about free speech and the FCC's role as a general matter in intervening as it relates to speech in the broadcast sector, for example, usually thinking about FCC regulation moving into an area where it doesn't already have jurisdiction is something that at CDT we would be a little bit concerned about. And so I think Jen has made a very, articulated a very good argument about why it's important to have this educational function, even if, personally I would say the regulatory creep into some of these other areas, app stores and various other sectors where the FCC generally doesn't have regulatory jurisdiction, is definitely something that would still want to stay away from. But you can't ignore it, even if you don't have jurisdiction over it.
Shane?
Do I have to? Okay, I have 2 questions. 2 things struck me in your presentation. First, the spectrum policy was some sense, just not a central part of what you just described. And that is part of the FCC's purview, and you sometimes hear people talk about the overlap between spectrum policy and other things. So that's sort of one question. And then the second question is perhaps more distant from the FCC's immediate interests are standards policies. In particular, the FCC from time to time does have to get involved in standards development. Not all the time, but particularly when it involves spectrum, but for other reasons as well. And again, you sort of alluded to it. Here, that was a little more, but again, it was in some sense brushed off. So those were the two topics I was interested to hear you talk about.
Yeah, I'll just mention one thing. We talked a little bit in our group about whether to consider spectrum issues, and we chose not to, in part because it's such a big topic and heavily studied in other groups at the FCC. So it's certainly important, and being silent on it may seem strange. So we probably should say something about it, but we were reluctant to kind of to jump into the pit and really try to flesh that entire space out. And I think your point about standards is quite well taken. Thanks for the feedback.
Leslie?
Thanks. Yep, and thanks, Jen. I think it was a really interesting overview of the general space, which I agree with you is quite helpful in terms of understanding specific, providing an appropriate context for the lens when looking at these things. But I wondered, in the context of the Open Internet Order, whether or not you or your group looked at the difference between mobile data versus providing internet access and internet services over a mobile data plan. Because if we were having this conversation, I guess 5 or 6 years ago, it would have been all about specialized applications running on mobile data networks, and it is in fact the platforms that kind of paved that and sort of brought the internet into the mobile world. It's my sense that blurring is going to become particularly acute exactly in the Wi-Fi offloading and related cases. So I wonder if the groups thought through things like how to make the distinction, or whether to make a distinction, or when does this look like the other kids, and when is it a redheaded stepchild?
I don't know if Marcus or Chuck, you would like to comment on that, because you guys have thought more about that.
Leslie, maybe just clarify the specific question again that you had. You were trying to make the distinction between internet services over a data plan versus something else.
Any other kind of application activity over a data plan. I mean, the internet is not unique in providing the ability to pass bits and make things work.
Okay. I mean, so if I think I know where you're going, and part of the discussion actually overlaps with the specialized services group, I believe, in some sense, in that there are clearly there are a whole range of things, services that are essentially provided using the internet access capability that's provided by ISPs and delivered through mobile devices. But there are clearly also, a whole range of different types of applications that are emerging that are not internet access services. They are, however, they're provided using over IP, and so there is that overlap with the charter of the specialized services group, which I think is there.
Left the conference.
I really driving them away, aren't I?
She can press 3 to leave in a huff, so that she didn't means it was just,
So does that get your question? I mean, I think it's a legitimate question, and certainly that is something that exists in the marketplace. And the question, part of it is how, to what extent do we allow specialized services to deal with that versus dealing with it in the mobile broadband group? I would say one other thing that this discussion has led to some degree of education of all of us about the complexity and the dynamism of the mobile broadband ecosystem. And part of the exercise of going through this set of relationships amongst the different players is to illustrate that, in fact, the service providers are not by any means, do not today actually have by any means the degree of control they had over the ecosystem perhaps that they had 5 years ago. With the emergence of smartphones, with the emergence of app stores, with the emergence of the various forms of control that the platform vendors have in attracting subscribers to their platforms. So that phenomenon is relatively new, and is still obviously changing, and it is in some sense, I think we continually, as people on the subgroup, bring information into our discussions, keep getting educated about the degree of complexity and dynamism that exists in this ecosystem as a whole. So it is, we have gone a bit further afield than strictly, where is the FCC's charter. But part of it is, I think, been in part just recognizing how dynamic that ecosystem is.
I guess it does raise some question about, if you look at the open internet order itself and where it really has bite, there is this distinction between wireline and wireless, and Wi-Fi is somewhere uncomfortably in between. That's what we're saying. And it's for people, I think, other than we to figure out what the actual application of the order would be to a primarily Wi-Fi network mediated through mobile. But it might be helpful for us to think about how we would advise thinking about this third category. So I don't have any specific idea on that, but it does seem like a really glaring thing to be possibly working on. David?
That was an interesting comment because, in fact, I hadn't really thought about Wi-Fi as a third category. The report and order basically talks about wireline and what I think in everybody's mind was cellular. And I've always assumed that Wi-Fi was a consumer apparatus hooked to the edge of a wireline network, and so it was unambiguously under the carrier's provision of internet service was clearly in the wireline bucket. And if somebody wants to put a little Wi-Fi box on the end of it, it didn't change anything. I think it gets interesting when you have people selling, when it's not a consumer service, when it's not in my home, but it's something like Starbucks, where I think the report and order clearly exempts providers of that sort from the obligations of neutrality. So I think there's actually an orthogonal cut through the system, which is all of the different providers that may be offering you Wi-Fi service. And I think to go back to the order and sort out which of them carry the same obligations. Starbucks is not a carrier.
David, we looked at that. We identified 4 types of Wi-Fi providers, including you yourself as the consumer in your home. And then there's the Starbucks non-carrier type. There's the enterprise environment, which may restrict access to you because you're not an employee, but is a provider of Wi-Fi services and sometimes a guest service. And then there's the...
join the conference.
Happily rejoins the conference. And then there's the Boingos and the GoGo in-flights and the Optimum Online. So we identify these 4 categories, each of which have different obligations, but each in sum total could provide a seamless mobile broadband experience over Wi-Fi. If you add those up, you end up with quite a bit of coverage. In fact, the 70% number is not based on your desire to use Wi-Fi, it's based on are you in sight of Wi-Fi. So that's how you typically get to that 70% number. It's essentially when in normal daily routine can I see Wi-Fi, and it's 70% of the time in that particular number.
I think the consumers are, even fairly naive consumers, are coming to understand with their mobile device that much of the time they are using a service which is not subject to any restriction on discrimination. And so things just stop and start working. I am currently on the guest network in Northwestern, and for some reason I couldn't receive mail because I use SSH and this and that and the other thing, and it just didn't work. They are blocking it. I suspect because of an attempt to influence the market, but for some model that secure email is an insecure protocol or something like that. And I had to open a VPN.MIT to be able to do it. So, you know, I was in Turkey for the last 3 weeks, and every hotel was its own adventure, right? What worked, what didn't work, why didn't it work, who understood what was going on. And I suspect this frustrates the consumer, but in some sense, I think it's outside the scope of anything other than market pressure, or at least that's my current expectation.
Although, as I think about Marcus's report of the 4 different categories, one is along an axis just of, are you in fact in the business of providing broadband? And that is independent of wireline versus wireless. If Northwestern provided to you a hub or a switch at the table and you happened to plug in and it was blocked, there'd be no doubt that it was wireline service, but I'm not sure it would be broadband service covered by the order. And the other axis is, when are the policy exemptions made for mobile in the order ones that should be sensitive to whether that mobile is Wi-Fi versus wireless, if it is a broadband provider providing it? Does that make sense? I know a bunch of people want to jump in, and we're a minute away from our scheduled end time, but we should get everybody in before we go on. Should we just go down the table with folks?
I think I've said my piece on this. I think it's fascinating space that needs exploration. And I see it as checking the obligations on the cellular part by virtue of what's possible on the Wi-Fi part. And secondly, maybe you could fulfill the obligation on the Wi-Fi part, and there should be some obligation on the service providers of Wi-Fi service to meet the same sorts of requirements if they're nominally providing a mobile broadband experience. So I think it's very interesting interplay we should look at more. But
I'd just like to agree with Chuck that I think that this does relate to the specialized services work, and it just means that we're not done with that until we have answers that actually work in both contexts.
Yes, I think following up the previous conversation on wireless and wireline, I had always interpreted it as mobile broadband and fixed line broadband. How it was delivered was not really, the technology used was not necessarily defining of which one it was. So we get another interesting case will be, for example, like maybe in villages and rural areas, when a provider puts a radio on the side of the house and delivers broadband via LTE, which would normally be considered a mobile wireless technology, but in this case is used for fixed wireless delivery of broadband. And so that provides another wrinkle to this, question of what parts of the order apply to that service. Thanks.
So I just started reading the order while we were talking about this, and a couple interesting things in there in the definitions. One is that it talks about mass market retail service, which I think kind of Northwestern gets exempt under that aspect.
University of Phoenix, however.
Yeah, right. There's always a corner case. But it's interesting, the distinction between fixed and mobile in the order. Fixed talks about being a service that serves end users primarily at fixed endpoints using stationary equipment. And mobile talks about being a service that serves end users primarily using mobile stations. And I have really no idea what either of those mean necessarily. So it is.
If you put wheels on the bottom of your station,
right.
It becomes mobile.
And what is a station? Yeah, there's all kinds of questions that raises. So it might be interesting to.
Well, we
think
should
about
give
that in the
Tejas an opportunity to say he has no comment.
That's exactly right.
Okay, then. we can continue down the line. Anyone else, or should we?
Well, I will just add,
Yeah.
we have debated that particular point a little bit, and there is a distinction that people seem to make between fixed services, nomadic services, and mobile services. So there, we could debate the definitions all day, but it is Wi-Fi as it is implemented today is not really designed to support truly mobile services, and in most cases. 802.11. In particular, there's a fast roaming section of the standard that was put in place to reduce the attach time when you're moving from one Wi-Fi access point to another that is operated by the same provider. So there's been some move in the direction to be able to do a better job than Wi-Fi traditionally did, which would essentially mean that you would have, if you move from one access point to another access point, even in the context where they're being operated within by the same provider or within an enterprise, there would be a long period of time of where the mobile device, where the device would be disconnected before it could reconnect, and the applications for which that would have a significant impact would be applications like voice over IP. It would essentially seem like the call had stopped. So the work is moving in that direction, but it's certainly not at the level of what the mobile network was designed to support.
Got it. Jen, any last thoughts? Okay, thank you very much for presenting on that. And Leslie was pointing out its relationship to specialized services, and in a good quirk of timing, David is now going to present on specialized services.
Do I have to do something magic to get my slides up here?
They're on the desktop.
Sorry, I'm a Mac person, so
Here, you want me to
you're
do
making
the
me
honors?
speak French.
How's that look?
It looks like the slides. No.
Oh, it's the wrong deck. Let's see. Is that it? The top one.
Yeah.
Great.
I have to apologize. This is going to be potentially incoherent. It depends on the support of the various people of my committee who worked to pull some slides together while I was out of the country for the last month. So I haven't been in a position to try to organize this. I'm going to give a very quick framing context and then invite a couple of people from the subcommittee to talk about some specific stuff. But let me just quickly review. The concept of specialized services is introduced in the report and order. And as part of the report and order, which brings this group into existence, we are asked to clarify and agree on the meaning of specialized service, to advise on the criteria that define it, and I'll explain what I mean by that, and to offer advice on issues that might concern the FCC in the future. The question of how you define specialized services has been a very challenging one for the committee. Before the previous meeting, we spent a fair amount of time trying to converge on what we would call the default definition. And the default definition was not necessarily one that people on the committee agreed with, but it was the one that we best distilled from the report and order. And I'm not trying to ding anybody, but the report and order, I think, is not as well drafted as it could have been, so this was a bit of a challenge. So we did come up with a working definition. I discussed this in detail at the last meeting, which was derived from the reading of the report and order. And subsequent to that, we then allowed ourselves to ask the following question: are the criteria as laid out in the report and order liable to be the ones that actually are effective in helping the FCC determine when something is a specialized service and then thus outside the scope of the report and order, or alternatively something that is sufficiently close to the topic of concern to the report and order that it is covered by the rules? And our approach here was to use case studies, and we're going to talk about a couple of them today. We quickly concluded that abstract argument wasn't effective, that specific cases might be better suited to test the criteria. In the last meeting, I put this slide up, and we settled on two of these cases. We talked about several of them. We talked about home security, which AT&T is now offering. We've talked about, but the two we're going to talk about today are what I'm going to call the set-top box case and the third-party purchasing of services of, in particular, third-party, the sale of specialized services to third party. This was motivated by a specific case, which was a game called EVE Online, where the creator of the game said if he could pay to obtain enhanced quality of service, he would certainly do so. And the question was, well, how might that be done? Would it be done as quality of service on the internet? Could it be done by delivering a consumer-facing specialized service that was available to third parties? And what I'd like to do now is to ask people to talk, ask other people on the committee to talk briefly about these two case studies. and then I'm going to summarize what I think the conclusions are, which is going to be exciting because I haven't seen the talks, and so I'm 1 month out of date, but nonetheless. So Chuck, you want to come talk about the set-top box case for a minute? I think what we tried to pull up a minute ago was your case, right? But you know how to drive Windows, so
I'll try.
So you drive.
All right, so as Dave said, one of the things the group has been struggling with is to try to find some objective criteria that we could use to identify what is a specialized service and what is an internet access service. We've come really most of the discussion has focused on the three criteria that are listed on this slide. One is reachability, which is in essence a service could be considered a specialized service if it does not provide reachability to all or substantially all of the internet. The second one is capacity isolation, and that essentially, if you read the report in order, it addresses the concern that service providers that are offering specialized services might not expand the network capacity for internet services because they are preferentially offering or using that capacity to deliver specialized services. So that's the concern that was addressed in the report in order. And the third category that's been discussed, generally speaking, relates to how a consumer or a user may pay for the service. The specific quotes that are not readable on this slide because they're in too small a point size are just some excerpts from the report in order. But the last one in particular, the specific thing that it seems to address the pricing and payment is. One specific issue is a concern that service providers not represent a service as a specialized service in order to avoid the openness requirements or the open internet rules. So that was one concern that seemed to specifically be mentioned there. As Dave said, we have decided that abstract argument will not get us anywhere, so we wanted to look at case studies, and the video set-top box case study was one of the ones that we focused on. I won't belabor the points on this slide. I think everyone knows what a video set-top box is. There are a number of categories that we identified for the purposes of being able to tease apart the different boxes that might be delivering video in the home. Obviously, there are different access network technologies that these devices connect to. There's also a point here that Comcast has made that cable video services typically have been categorized as Title VI services, and so the part of the discussion is whether moving those services to non-internet-based IP changes that or not, and that's part of the discussion that we've been having. And obviously, video set-top boxes may provide other services other than just delivering video. They may be an environment for hosting other applications. They may support digital video recorder functionality and so on. The categories of set-top boxes, there are cable, telco provided video set-top boxes is clearly one category. There's another category that was identified, which are third-party set-top boxes, such as the Xbox, which have been designed or integrated into cable telco provided services. And then there's a whole slew of third-party unaffiliated, sometimes referred to as over-the-top video set-top boxes, Apple TV, Roku, and so on. Everyone probably has one or more of these in their home. So we took each of these three categories and then looked at how they essentially address the three criteria. I'll go through it briefly so as not to take too much time. The cable/telco provided video set-top boxes Typically, they are not providing access to the internet. They're providing access to video content that is specific to the service that the consumers purchase, some channel lineup and so on. Capacity isolation. Historically, in cable networks, actually, it was not an IP service at all. It was actually provided by physically discrete QAM channels. So it's the open internet report and order is not even applicable there. But in telco, IPTV services, and increasingly MSO services are providing or delivering linear video from this channel lineup, as it were, using logically separated bandwidth, using IP, and essentially pricing and payment. These are services that are subscribed to as standalone services, independent of the internet access service that may be delivered over the same access plant. So I guess the conclusion, or at least a tentative conclusion, is that all three of these attributes seem to suggest that live or linear video delivered to a cable or telco provided set-top box is either not an IP service, as in the traditional case of QAM, or is a Title VI IP-based cable service, or is a specialized service. And that's the debate that the group is in the middle of, and we will undoubtedly continue to discuss these three criteria, but this is a first cut at characterizing how things play out. Third-party set-top boxes accessing these multi-channel video programming services. Again, in reachability, in the two specific case examples that are listed here, both the Comcast and the AT&T UVerse service, it is possible for the consumer to purchase their own Xbox and have it effectively integrate into the same service that the telco or cable provided set-top box integrates into. To first order, it's a separate device that is accessing exactly the same service. And it is accessing it in pretty much the same way as the telco provided or cable provided set-top box, that is, using logically separated IP bandwidth, and it's included in the standard subscription fee. So again, these are specific cases. I think other cases that might arise might require some specific investigation, but certainly for the specific case of the set-top boxes, the Xbox that we've looked at, they're logically and functionally identical to the first category that we discussed. Finally, the unaffiliated or over-the-top video set-top boxes. I think these are obviously a different category. They're, again, not providing broadband internet access. They're using a broadband internet access service to access content from anywhere on the internet. The current way that the networks are implemented, there is no distinction between the video content delivered to these set-top boxes via IP and other IP traffic that might be delivered over that network. And pricing and payment is via a separate arrangement with the over-the-top provider. And in fact, in the case of some of these, you buy the box and then it has access to multiple content sources that the consumer has an independent relationship with. Obviously, none of these over-the-top video services have been subject to Title VI requirements historically. So these are not internet services either. They're probably also not specialized services. They are just services that avail themselves of broadband internet access. So that is the summary. And
thank you, Chuck. Should we see if there's discussion, questions, comments? David, I don't know if there's anything you want to add right now. You'll need a mic for it.
I was going to ask Leslie if she wanted to talk about the Eve case and then come back. So why don't we do the Eve thing quickly and then see if there's any discussion. I'll put up a summary slide after that.
Are those slides on this computer or? Yes.
We're not sure they are there, actually.
Yeah, I'm demonstrating that it wasn't clear to me that I was actually going to be presenting this today, so. No.
We're not sure where the slides live, so they're not on the machine.
Could it be as simple as switching, or is this?
Oh, I don't think the deck's on the desktop.
No, but I could do it from my, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, if you want. Either way.
No, it's all right. Since this is, I'm demonstrating that I didn't realize that we were going to talk about this in any depth today, which is fine, because the first thing I was going to say was that this is very much a work in progress, and there isn't agreement across the working group about where we're landing on this. So it's just as well not to try to present it as if we are all together. So the background on this particular case study was that the Internet Protocol itself delivers on a best effort basis, which is fine for most applications that have been traditionally available over the Internet. It makes for very resilient network, so on and so forth. But it also challenges delivering any kind of service with a guaranteed quality of service. Again, this is sort of understood and known and worked with, but increasingly there are applications out there for which the service providers believe they want, maybe even believe they have a right to, but certainly desire having some level of guaranteed end-to-end delivery quality of service for something like an online game, something that's real-time for applications that are particularly sensitive to latency and jitter. It's not just that you get a freeze frame in your movie, but if you get a freeze frame in your game, your competitor who's playing across the world may take the opportunity to shoot and kill you. And for people who play these games, I understand this is not motivating and may cause you to stop subscribing to the service. So that's kind of the illustration of why this is actually, why consistent behavior and quality of, guaranteed understanding of how this application is going to work is important to providers of these services. So that's their desire. There are any number of possible ways that that these desires could be challenged as packets travel from their network, actually delivering the service to an access point, somebody playing the game, and there are any number of ways that these things could be addressed. But given that this is a desire in the universe, it's not, and there have actually been expressions of interest for I, service provider, will pay you, access provider, money if you can guarantee me a certain level of service towards your customers. So when we looked at that basic question and said, well, how would you actually wind up doing this in ways that are or are not consistent with the Open Internet Report and Order, we looked at three approaches to providing it. The first approach would be if the service provider provided access to this application service as a special add-on through their own, through some other share, some other portion of the access network, then that portion being provided over which the user's internet access is being provided. That would ensure that there is capacity isolation, so the user's internet access is not impacted. And in general, that doesn't impact the openness and the general nature of the user's internet access. The second approach would be if the access provider provided some level of improved priority to access that particular application or game, and provided that over the actual internet service. And this is sort of a canonical or traditional network neutrality question, when suddenly a particular application service traffic is getting a different priority than the general internet. So that seems fairly clearly not in line with the Open Internet Report and Order. And then the third case was saying, all right, suppose it's not the ISP that's actually providing prioritized access to a game service that is given the ISP money, but rather the ISP is allowing its customers to choose those services that it would like to prioritize, because that then puts it back in the hands of the user. There are some questions there about implementability and whether one user's choice would impact their neighbors, for instance, but it's perceived as a third option. The question that came up in all of this, in saying, the general trend of this articulation is if you're not messing with the user's internet access and not changing the priority or delivery of other services, competing services over the general internet access, then it's fine. The question that came up in the committee was, well, wait a minute, are we in fact saying that you can offer any other service with prioritized access as long as what you do is offer it, call it something specialized? And I think that that's a point that deserves further discussion and is one of the reasons why this overall case study isn't completely baked. Thanks.
I'm sorry if I put you on the spot there. I think that was exactly right, which is we ain't done talking about it yet, but I think these have been very revealing. I want to just say a couple of things, and then maybe if you want to stop and have some questions. These criteria that we came up with, you can find some possible linkage of these to text that's in the report and order, but we've clearly, in my view, gone beyond what the report and order said in pulling these three criteria out. Capacity isolation is really not something that is used as a definition of a specialized service in the report and order. And it begs an interesting question. If we are playing with these criteria as things the FCC may want to deal with in the future, to what extent is it the and or the or of the list? And I don't think we really have a clean answer to that. Obviously, or would be more beneficial to people who would like to have things classified as specialized services. I don't think you want to reinterpret the order in such a way that it's harder to make something to be defined as a specialized service, but this is really entirely on the table. So what I want to do next is very quickly talk about what I'm going to call task 2, but maybe we should stop and very quickly. I'm way over time, so I want to be a little efficient here, but do people want to have questions or comments about what I called task 1, which is these case studies?
Yeah, well, I'll ask a question. As we think back to the mobile broadband thing a little bit and trying to connect the two topics, if we think of a video service delivered over mobile broadband, the properties of that service would be slightly different. It wouldn't have a set-top box. It would be probably, the device would have full reachability of the internet, and there would be pricing and payment. But it's nominally the same service offer, just now on a mobile device. And I wonder, just as a question, not that I have an opinion, whether in fact we should think about that as a way to also think about a definition of a specialized service, that you can't have the service materially change its categorization. At least there'd have to be a logic for that, because you are now delivering it over a mobile infrastructure, it seems to me. But it's just an observation.
Any other questions or comments? I mean, I agree with you.
Okay.
But I'm not entering into a long debate because we're over time here.
Yeah,
so it's something for the.
Yeah.
So just one comment on the 3 criteria. Just in listening to Chuck and Leslie talk about the 2 case studies, it seems like actually capacity isolation is the one where all of the discussion needs to go or has been going. Because I kind of feel like with reachability and with pricing and payment, it's sort of, I think we kind of broadly agree that, yes, a service that allows you to reach any other endpoint on the internet is probably not very specialized, and a service that you pay separately for, distinctly from your internet service, is more the kind of thing that we are interested in. So I feel like actually capacity isolation is the one that's most interesting, as opposed, the other 2 I feel like we could kind of come to consensus on pretty easily.
Kevin?
So one of the things that we talked about in the in our meetings was something around the fact that just because something is IP doesn't mean it's the internet, and I think there was some universal agreement around that. And if I look back at before kind of the IPTV rollout, things were analog, and they used the spectrum on the access network in an analog, and this is decades ago. Along came digital, and what digital do is it enabled incremental capacity. It gave more consumer choice, more demand, fulfillment. And then later, what we're evolving to now is IP, which is also enabling more demand. So really the the broadband service is a part of the overall infrastructure. But I think it's important to note that these technology evolutions, we have to be very careful of saying, because you've evolved, you suddenly are reclassified, and make sure we understand that. Because if we look at what FiOS have ever rolled out, if it, you know, if with under, you know, very stringent classification, same thing with UVerse. We need to promote and enable IP technology, not drive, you know, kind of a wedge into it.
Hey, Jonathan, it's Brad Burnham.
Yep, go ahead, Brad.
I agree that we don't want to get caught in the trap of making these distinctions based on technology, because the technology is evolving. And I also agree that the world's better off as we converge on IP, so we certainly don't want to penalize people for moving in that direction. But the other side of this is that if we look at it from the end user's perspective, that's probably the most stable part of the ecosystem. And the end user, if they're consuming a video service, isn't making a distinction about how it's being delivered. And if we're concerned with preserving innovation for the sake of the end users, then I think we have to be careful about making a distinction based on the technical means of delivering a service if it appears to the user to be identical. And I think that would be true of the over-the-top services versus the services that are provided perhaps by a carrier to a cable box. The user's consumption is identical or very close to identical. And if one of those services is privileged versus the other, then there's a risk that, you know, if there's a vendor in that equation, perhaps the carrier that already has significant market power, there's a risk that the consumer is going to be disadvantaged by not having real choice for something that they perceive as, you know, essentially the same service.
Thank you.
That is one of the issues that we are trying to understand, or in particular the boundary conditions in that situation. Let me quickly press on. We had, at the last meeting, I talked about the fact our subgroup had 2 tasks, and the other task was not focused on specific case studies, trying to understand whether one or another offered service fell in the category of specialized service or an internet service. It was a more general question, which is, do the emergence of specialized services as a whole raise competitive concerns with respect to the public internet offering? And sorry, I'm just completely clueless here. This was the concern. You can read the slide. The concern is that as specialized services, because they're sharing the underlying capacity, could compete with the internet, and it could be that the competition would cause the internet service to be limited in such a way that classes of applications are not viable. The cynical interpretation of this has been the dirt road future for the information highway. I used this slide at the last meeting. And the FCC has stated in the report and order that they want to monitor and measure something such that they understand how this is evolving. So the question is, well, what are they supposed to be measuring? And one way to ask this question is, how much internet is enough that we are not concerned about the internet platform as a space where applications can be offered and innovation can occur? Another way to think about it is comparing what could be done on a specialized service versus the public internet. And there's sort of conflicting intuitions here. One intuition is, well, the facilities owners are, in fact, privileged, legitimately privileged, because they've invested the capital in these infrastructure. And presumably one of the reasons that they would offer a service there is because in some sense it's different or better. If it was in no way distinguishable from the internet service, why would you bring it to market? On the other hand, if the platform is used in such a way that there's tremendous discrimination against internet applications, then obviously that raises some sort of question. So the thing we set ourselves to think about was how to...
We should make it full screen just so...
Well, you know, I tried 3 times to find the button and couldn't find it and just gave up. What was the button again? What did you hit there?
It was the icon of a screen.
Oh, I hit it and I got a menu of 27 options. Obviously, you have the magic Windows touch. Right.
You take that back.
Say again?
I was making a joke.
Okay. So one way we thought about this was to look at what we're calling quality of experience. When we looked at the technical parameters, bandwidth, latency, all this kind of stuff, we asked ourselves, in order to answer the question that we've just posed, is there any reason why the FCC should be measuring new things? Could we think of any new technical parameters they should be measuring? And the answer is the committee didn't come up with any. We haven't closed that discussion. But when you ask, when is the internet service good enough, there's no obvious way to relate a particular bandwidth to good enough. So what we started to look at is the consumer experience. And we decided that this relates to what I'm going to call the user-facing quality of experience. And one of the things I referred to in this context was a report that the National Academies did over 10 years ago, in which they had to define broadband, and they refused to quantify it. I was on this committee, so sort of full disclosure. But what they said is, here are two possible definitions of adequate broadband. One of them is, and this had to do with the access link. The access link performance is not the limiting factor in the user's capability of running today's apps. Okay, and you might call that good enough. And the second definition was better, which is not only is it good for today's app, but it allows a certain amount of experimentation and innovation. So there's a little headroom there. And this brought to mind a possible strategy for the FCC to use in answering the question of good enough, which is, and by the way, although Alyssa wasn't on the phone calls, I think this was your idea in a different context. This came out of we. Okay, so I give her credit. Pick a basket of current and leading edge applications, and then there's an experiment that has to be done. It's a science experiment, which is try putting users in front of the application, running them and asking them to rate their quality of experience. This is like MOS scores. And come up with a formula that relates the quality of experience as the users rate it to the underlying parameters. This has been done for voice, it's been done for web pages, it's been done for video. In fact, you can come up with a formula that says, well, you put in this much speed and this much latency, and the user will say this. And then you could take these applications and come up with a blended quality of experience score as a measure of good enough. Now, this is something the committee's been chewing on. We just started talking about this. I wanted to expose this idea, but all I want to say is we think that the question of good enough is the important one for the FCC to think about, and we're trying to come up with a way to help the FCC think about it. So we're over time, and I'm going to invite questions, and then I'm going to quit. Kevin.
So one of the things I want to comment on is kind of the original statement on the phone about, does the user perceive it as the same service? One thing is when you're at home and you're watching TV and the TV pixelates or goes out, you make a phone call, you may get a truck roll, you get service, people reacting to it. There's a certain service level agreement that and relationship the customer expects. If I can't get my YouTube video, I don't do the same thing. I typically will call my ISP, whether it's the ISP issue or not. So I think there is still some differences in the level of service that's being offered. The second thing I would like to say, at first we discussed the EVE Online and saying maybe quality of service is good, but maybe quality of service is bad. I just quickly wrote, I find 7 points of performance impacting elements around the internet. There's the content choice of what, bit rate, resolution, and so forth. There's the servers that are delivering it. There's the backbone that it uses as its exchange point. There's the ISP. There's the access network, and then there's a home network. So there's multiple different. When you do a linear video of a standard cable offering, you have one person responsible for it end to end. So I think the consumer still has that perception, of 2 points of services. The other question about how much internet is enough. I think there's a lot of measurement. We talked about it last time that's going on right now, and I think we should continue it. But the question is, are you getting what is advertised and is growing? And I think there's, the FCC measurement around that gives a lot of information that we're closely keeping an eye on.
One of the things we talked about is there's a distinction between are you getting what is advertised, and I think what is a different question is what was advertised and what you bought good enough relative to this other set of considerations. It's not just what you got was advertised. It's a more complicated space of what is good enough. And of course, there's a question whether you have an obligation as an ISP to deliver something that's good enough.
Mhm.
Would you rather have something crappy as opposed to nothing?
And are there more parties involved in what's good enough these
Right,
days?
absolutely.
It's not just the ISP. As I mentioned, performance, there's 7 different, across
yeah.
probably 5 different parties.
Any other comments on this stuff? Because I know we're
Well,
over time here.
yeah, Dave, I know we have to shift gears, but I wanted to ask about the activities of the working group pointing towards our July meeting and kind of annual bookend in Washington. And that is, the commission appears to, in the order, be relying upon our committee to help in monitoring developments in this area. So I'm just curious if it would be helpful to be thinking about whether the landscape has materially changed at all for the things we're roughly calling specialized services since the time of the order. It will, I think, have been 2 years since the order was put out, and of course, much more time went into drafting it. So I'm curious if it would be worth it to do stop motion on that. And secondly, your criteria seem very useful as a way of trying to help the commission flesh out what was an open question at the time of the order, which is, what do we exactly mean by this, and how do we sift the useful, innovation-promoting, investment-promoting things from the bad stuff?
Yes.
Excellent. Great.
I just want to rebound though on Kevin's point. I think it's a very good one. If we were to measure a QOE, Kevin's point is you don't know which of the 7 parties are impacting the QOE. So the problem becomes, so I wouldn't want to go off and start measuring something that intrinsically at the end of the day, you would have a 7 parameter space that could provide the same QOE. Only one of those parameters is the internet bandwidth. And so that's a bit troubling to me when one of 7 parameters is what you're interested in, but the QOE depends on 7 parameters. So I think it's going to be unproductive, is my sense, to actually try and do this.
So I think that I agree with what you're saying entirely, and I think in the particular case study of the game service that I was articulating, there are probably a lot of things to do in 6 of those before you look at the 7th and regulate. But I also think that the existence of commercial interest and drivers towards this probably make it important to articulate that in some level of detail, in the same way that Jen was talking about having greater context to look at, to understand the space before you look at the wireless space with a particular lens. We can look to Europe and see the EDNO proposals for, their perception on what happens with businesses and internet bandwidth. So, agree, but I think more detail is needed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also, at least in kind of the original instantiation, there seemed to be interest actually from multiple of those parties in participating in the measurement. It was sort of this aha moment of like, well, actually the offer of the special or of the over-the-top service is already trying to measure things. The access providers are already trying to measure things. Could we have a test bed where we can control the home network, we can control the data center network, and so actually you could start to take out some of that variability and run a small scale measurement test bed that would allow you to compare across providers and across different services performance. So it's not just focusing on the access network or just blaming the access network for whatever you find. At least that I think that's kind of an ideal to work to. I don't know if anyone will ever get there, but it seems like something that would be very nice to have.
All right. Good. Kelly? Thank you, David, and thank you, Chuck. So let's move to Shane now for the Economic Impacts Working Group, and it's another opportunity to thank Shane for hosting us here in Chicago.
Thank you to the Searle Foundation for helping us as well, and the Kellogg School Management for giving us this room today, and then the law school for the room for the meetings later. And particularly thanks to Derek Gunderson, who's sitting in the back, who did much of the work to get us ready for this. Okay, where am I? Oh, here we go, last one, good. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here on this beautiful day. My God, we have the best weather we're going to get all year. As we know in Chicago, we don't get nice days like this often, so thanks for staying inside. Okay, so going to take 15 minutes to talk about a report that the Working Group on Economic Impact has been working on, titled Policy Issues and Data Caps and Usage-Based Pricing. The slides are just going to provide a summary of the topics and highlight some of the controversial arguments. The report itself has quite a lot of substance in it and has been a group effort. Consequently, as one can imagine from so much group effort, it's really just impossible to get the nuance of every sentence in a report like this. So I'm at best going to try to just give you a feel for what's in the report. Here's a table of contents, so just to give you a sense of all the topics, and I'm going to briefly go through each of these, but not substantively in some cases. Okay, so the overall report covers the following question: what is the source of concern with data caps and wireline non-specialized services? Our principal goals were to provide definitions and identify concerns and organize the conversation into subcategories and identify open questions. Particularly, we tried to bridge the divide between vernacular conversation and the various perspectives of shareholders, stakeholders here. And if you're at all a reader of the online world, you recognize there's actually quite a lot of divide there, and so it took quite a bit of an effort. We first have to talk about defining terms. I'd say the two that came under the most discussion were usage-based pricing and data caps. In particular, usage-based pricing in the internet context is based on the amount of time online or volume of data transmitted. So that is, the price is sensitive to that. And data caps play a role within usage-based pricing. Typically, when a user goes over a cap, the service offered changes. Often there are 1 or 2 warnings, and then there will be a change in access speed or additional overage charges. And as we'll show in a moment, in rare cases, suspension or termination of service. The use of the terms itself was, a point of debate even among the group. Caps, thresholds, usage-based pricing are all terms we're going to use, and we're not implying any particular judgment. The report also uses the phrase specialized service without passing judgment. We don't really want to, that's someone else's. That's another subgroup, and we respect the other subgroup, but for practical purposes, we have to use the term on occasion. So the order does talk about usage-based pricing. I read this last time. It leaves open, I'm not going to repeat it now, but it leaves open questions, primarily because you can see that the order is expecting the internet would evolve in new ways and include multiple interesting experiments and new forms of pricing, and that shouldn't surprise anyone. We talked a bit about the role of caps and usage-based pricing in the context of competition. Typically, most of the issues that arise in settings where it's perceived that there are no or few substitutes. And our report talks about why it is actually quite difficult to define what that means in practice. And that's just the standard first question you always get, which is define your market. In particular, you do hear a number of people bring up concerns about high-end markets, which then begs the question, what is a high-end market, and how would you know a competitive one when you saw it? We talk a bit about why it's actually a moving target, and there's no simple rule or benchmark. And nonetheless, analysis is possible even if you can't define a market precisely at this point, and we just are cautious about sweeping generalizations throughout the report. One of the, I think, accomplishments I'd have to say is, trying to organize the conversation is I'm actually kind of proud of our group for getting the facts. A lot of people contributed to this. This was really very interesting. Just what are the thresholds? What are their range? The report talks about many firms having caps, many not having them. Many of them are part of a system of thresholds or part of a pricing plan or tiers. Some have many tiers. Some vary by tiers. And when the overage charges arise, they tend to be in a relatively similar level. There's an appendix devoted to this. So there's a lot of detail that I'm not going to go over in this brief talk. Again, we also went over just how did you benchmark these caps. That's actually very challenging to do because there's a variety of estimates about the very moving target that you would want to reference them against, and how much growth are we observing or not is sort of an open question as well that we talk about in the report. So just to give you a sense, here's one of the most recent graph of distribution of use across households in the FCC data, with some caution about the high end having fewer observations, and so there's the statistician in me says there's a larger standard error there, but that's the give you a sense of what 150 or 300 cap would look like relative to use today. So then we we look at different stakeholders, and the report talks about the perception of users. The core question that we start with is, what do users know and think, and do users, as in other groups we talk about measurement, do users have the ability to measure their own data use in real time? What tools exist to measure usage by application, and can users, one of the interesting open questions we were left with was, can users monitor use in their households when they have multiple users and multiple devices? Another interesting open question we were left with was, is this a temporary or permanent concern? I mean, clearly there's an education component to it, and so we're left with, we want to come back to this in the future to look again. Another topic that typically gets discussion is user control. How much do users control their own use? If they don't control their own data, then the thresholds have the potential to punish users. And the issue is that there's web-embedded video and site ads increasingly, and there's automated updates and a lot of inefficient software out there. And in addition, users do have some control in ad blockers and some local traffic management. We more or less came to the conclusion that this does not seem to be a concern for the average user yet. And in light of future growth, perhaps we want to revisit that question. Then we turn to perception of ISPs. Most ISPs views thresholds and caps as part of usage-based pricing, and that's providing a pricing mechanism for matching bandwidth demand with purchase behavior. They also view the innovations in usage-based pricing as important to the delivery of internet service and content, and just as important as other kinds of innovations we observe in this space. And a key point that comes up continuously is that this permits lower prices to some users with small consumption, which allows some to have access who wouldn't otherwise have it if all had to pay the same price. In addition, there's a remark that we should recognize you could have continuous metering here, but we don't. We have, when you get usage-based pricing, they tend to be in tiers, and that offers some predictability and bill stability for many users because it's in these ranges rather than changing as month-to-month use changes. The report talks about usage-based pricing and caps in terms of price discrimination. This is a term in economics. It's not meant to be pejorative. The word discrimination takes on word in the vernacular. It's not meant at all here. It's just nonlinear pricing. Typically, that means it's associating higher prices with higher costs and higher willingness to pay, and avoiding potential losses that would have risen had some users been forced not to buy at all. The order does permit this, and it's certainly what we're observing is consistent with the order, particularly in light of the idea that light users do not have to subsidize heavy users. Okay. Then we talk a bit about managing network growth from the ISP perspective, and do caps and thresholds reduce data use? And we want to recognize that's a necessarily speculative answer. We really don't have good data to say one way or the other. We review some of the arguments. I'll just say them briefly here. One of the typical arguments is that a cap will help develop incentives to increase efficiency and reduce overall use. For example, reducing BitTorrent use for somebody who's doing it 24/7, or somebody who's using a high-definition security camera when something much less than that would be sufficient. In addition, when someone's running a business out of their home, it's incenting them to actually use an appropriate business contract rather than a home contract. It's also, from ISP perspective, important to recognize that this provides incentives for efficient data delivery, and to develop new technologies for edge providers to more efficiently deliver data. And then we were left with the open question of what sort of data would we want in order to inform the open question. I mean, what data would help settle some of these arguments in the future one way or the other. We also talk about managing instantaneous congestion, another topic that comes up quite a bit. It's not a stated rationale for most use of tiers and caps. And then there's an important and interesting note and a piece of speculation. I think we've heard others on the committee make this, that if large total users over the month are also happen to be the biggest users at peak moments, then if a data threshold incentivizes such a user to reduce their overall data use, it might actually have a consequence for peak usage. But again, that's speculative. We don't have data one way or the other to say. Generally, ISPs do not perceive users asking for peak load thresholds, and there have been a very small number of experiments, but really not very many that we know of. And as before, we don't have data one way or the other to refute ideas here. Finally, we finished with talking about edge providers. Edge providers are concerned that a widely used cap can reduce demand for the most data-intensive services and reduce the entry of data-intensive firms. There is an open question about whether that reduces commercialization of innovation. The argument here is that historical improvements in data delivery have largely been independent of caps and therefore aren't really going to aren't really the way to go about incentivizing that kind of innovation. There's also an argument that providers make about what's happened to our neighbors in the north. Canada has used a cap, and the argument there, or the perception of edge providers, is that it hurt the user experience. Netflix, in particular, expressed the opinion that it affected their ability to market services, and they had to change what they offered in order to stay below the cap, and that hurt the user experience. A third argument that is sometimes made is that caps and thresholds are comparatively minor from the ISP's point of view, in that it can shape a small percentage of ISP users, but those same users can be a big percentage of an edge provider's market demand, and so there's this asymmetry in the way the two parties view caps and thresholds, and edge providers place some emphasis on that. Again, we'd have to say little data. It would be an interesting open question is what data would you want in order to resolve some of these interesting questions. Finally, our last topic is edge providers are quite sensitive about the interplay between caps and specialized services. This overlaps a bit with the talk we just heard. In some settings, our ISPs will be integrated in the provision of a service that substitutes for something that an edge provider is doing, and then the threshold or the cap can provide a method for a differential treatment of traffic, and from an edge provider's perspective, favor certain applications by the ISP. And typically this leads to a question of what a level playing field would mean in this setting. As I said, many aspects of this debate are taken up by the specialized services group, and so in some sense it's outside of what we're going to talk about, and particularly for the narrow question of what role do caps play, which is a very specific question. We just raised the question without really resolving it, and that's basically our purpose for the report. There's a lot changing in this area as we speak, and we lead with the open question in this area in particular. Should policy be flexible and adaptable or fixed and predictable? There's actually not a really obvious answer. So again, just to finish up, here's a summary of all the topics that I left a lot out just in the interest of time, but just to give you a flavor for what we've covered, and just again to remind you what our purpose was. Our purpose was not to resolve all the debate. Rather, our purpose here was to provide definitions and identify concerns and organize a lot of the discussion into all these subcategories and identify open questions and bridge the divide. This part, I learned quite a bit by doing the exercise myself, and I hope others do too, by reading the report. and we hope it motivates others to continue the conversation. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Shane. Leslie?
Yeah, thanks. And I'm really glad you brought up the Netflix in Canada example because I would have. But I also then just pulled up the data caps in the main service provider in Canada, and the where the typical service plans fall as against your graph are pretty telling. The basic Canada, the basic ISP service plan data cap basically would 50% of the users of ISPs here use more data than the limited cap. If you can unpack that sentence, I think it's pretty telling. Anyway, but my question was whether or not you looked at or thought about looking at how this data usage trend changes over time, has been changing over time, because I think as more people get used to the notion of, watching a Netflix movie while they're running on their treadmill, the usage may in fact grow considerably.
Yeah, so one of the interesting debates here was to try to get a consensus growth rate for data usage overall, and then a consensus on the incidence of the distribution of growth. So let me unpack both of those. First of all, if you were to ask, we read a number of reports, and estimates varied between 20 and 40% on average.
Right.
And then second, open question, is it the highest users who are growing more, or the smallest, the median and below median user who are growing more? Also open debate about that.
Right.
Yeah. That's one place, by the way, where some data would be really useful. And, any data would be useful.
Yep. Chip?
Thank you. I'm not sure hopefully this is relevant to what you just said, but Cisco has the Visual Network Index where they put out data on various things, and the update to the mobile index was released in February, and unfortunately the fixed line is not out to the end of May, and I don't have that, but the mobile numbers kind of showed a pretty significant decrease in the percentage of bandwidth that the top 1% are using over the last 3 years. So you see the top 1% of bandwidth users are using a significantly less percentage of the overall bandwidth. So that I think could be considered, part of the bundling and tiered structure of the mobile data market. On the other hand, it's interesting that the top 20%, I think, is increasing as the percentage. So some of those numbers you could look at, might be useful to you or not.
Great. Kevin?
Thanks.
Thank you.
So the interesting difference between mobile and wireline is, if you look at wireline, and even the FCC data supports this, the impact of caps on the wireline side in the U.S. is very small. It's a very small number of users, where on the wireless side the caps are very low, so it impacts more. So I think the behaviors of the top end are going to be very different. So we have to look at that. And one thing that's pretty clear is caps right now are all about fear and hope, and there's not a lot of facts and data around it. So I think it's important that we start really digging into the facts and data around what the impact is, both from a consumer behavior standpoint, but also from an application standpoint. I'll give one quick example and some other things that are happening. Back, I don't know how many years ago, there was this new app that came out that would push content to your desktop, and it was a screensaver, and it pushed news and so forth. And suddenly everybody downloaded that app, and it completely choked the network. And even when you weren't even on your computer, it was just constantly sending traffic. There was no efficiency in it at all. That caused enough problems that the application designers changed it. So there's that incentive of network is not an unlimited resource, and application providers are just as responsible to make sure that users understand what's going on, that they have some controls, and they're being a bit more efficient. Because if you look at the way VOD and linear video is delivered today, if no one's watching it, it tries to figure that out and stops the sending of traffic. And I think the whole incentive around making sure that the internet remains efficient is also important as well.
Kevin, it's interesting there. There's the example you just gave is one in which the software itself tries to limit. Another example might be these days if you watch a YouTube video and pause it, it doesn't load all the way to the end of the video. It just goes a little bit ahead, waiting to see whether you're going to want to see that stuff anyway.
Right.
That approach versus one in which one would say, oh, the users need to be very educated about things and become a tiny bit gun-shy about using too much internet. And you could see a plus and a minus to the latter approach, because ideally, since we don't know what the uses are going to be later, we might well want some of those early adopters to be, you know, the Wheel of Cheese cam, where you can just watch cheese ripen in Somerset, England. Like, it sure seems like a waste of bandwidth to me, because it doesn't even convey the smell. But it's something that may portend the kind of, say, live streaming that something with Google Glass might enable. And so, I don't know, one person's waste is another person's treasure.
That's true, and it is that interactive versus non-interactive content that I actually am looking at versus content I'm just downloading.
Right.
And there is that balance of making sure that we continue to promote that what I get is what I use, the interactive performance and so forth with this, you know, if when I come home, all my lights are on in my house, right? Because they don't pay the bill. Right, my kids don't pay the bill. So,
Yes.
you know, making sure that there is some understanding that it's not an unlimited resource.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yep, Chip?
Yeah, I think one thing maybe looking forward, I think you've mentioned it. I know it's in the report, and I think you mentioned it, is that the usage-based pricing and these are explicitly allowed in the open internet order. So we'll be looking at what part of data caps and what part of usage-based pricing would be of, you know, relevance to the, I mean, interest to monitoring for the open internet order, you know, going forward. I think you do address it in the report to some extent, but it's kind of focusing on that aspect. I mean, data caps and base pricing is really interesting to me on many levels, but you know, for this purpose, I would like to see just kind of like, okay, what do we need to start really look at here? You know, in terms of the transparency working group, the specialized services working group, you know, are there implications for the other working groups to look at? Thanks.
Yeah, that is partly addressed in the report, but you know, if you think we've missed something, we're certainly still open to that question, those kinds of comments.
Another somewhat related comment to all these things is, do we think about the concept of if someone were to provide, probably a service provider, the ability for the user to manage their own bandwidth, whether it went on Wi-Fi, cellular, whether it was prioritized, not prioritized, does that create transparency in itself because the user is aware, largely, as long as they're things that the user understands, meaning you could just say, I like this more than that, they understand that concept. I want to take this on Wi-Fi because they understand it's probably going to be more costly to take it over cellular. Is that a level of transparency that we could actually productively say, operators, whoever they are, Wi-Fi operator, cellular provider, if they just provided the ability for the user to provide input on how they'd like things, is that a degree of transparency that would be productive and would be application independent? Kevin?
You know, I think we talked about that in the previous examples that Leslie talked about. Is there's slippery slope in providing that capability of discriminating one application versus another, even if the user wants to do that. I think it's an interesting proposal. Understanding what happens from a customer traffic or you know, different kind of, I guess, labels on applications. Maybe we can talk about that during after the transparency discussion, because there's lots of discussion about labels on ISP. I don't want to steal thunder here, but there's also what about labels on applications, right? You know, we don't rate you know, do labels on electricity, but we do on appliances. You know, kilowatts per hour, cars, miles per gallon. And understanding more about the applications that you have running. Do you have control over them? Are they constantly doing something? Do you have the ability to change the bit rate delivered and so forth?
So I guess a label there, one difference would be whether it's labeled along an efficiency scale. It may be high bandwidth, but it appears to be coded in a way that is bandwidth sensitive versus just, by the way, this uses a lot of bandwidth.
And bandwidth, maybe you don't even know.
Yeah.
It's constantly doing something that you don't even know.
Yeah.
And you have no control over that.
Mhm. All right. Thank you very much, Shane. Why don't we now move to our last working group report from Chip on transparency.
Let's see. Escape. Is that what that one? Okay.
Click on the bottom right. It should give you the desktop, the very bottom right.
That's what I'm looking for.
I think it's that one.
This one?
I think it's, oh no, it's Jen. There you are, you're Chip.
Oh, the one with my name on it.
Yeah.
That's a sure giveaway, isn't it? Okay. How do I make this full screen?
No.
Oh, there it is. I think I see it right there. Whoops, nope, hit the wrong one.
F5 will do it too.
You got to have you got to know the symbols and have eye-hand coordination to hit those little things. So, thank you very much. Russ sends his regrets. He couldn't be here today, so he asked me to do the presentation for the Transparency Working Group. Sorry. So the Transparency Working Group has been working on the label program. At our last meeting, I think previously we had discussed this as a logo program, but we've decided to start thinking of it more as a type of nutritional label as opposed to a logo in terms of the name change. The goal is still the same, is to look at allow an apples-to-apples comparison when considering service provider selection or when considering changing service providers, is the general goal of the program. Is to provide some information to users, to customers, consumers on services in a standard format that is easily understandable. The items currently, that are under discussion for the label program there have been basically three basic items that we've talked about. Performance, including which are upload speed and download speed. The data caps, at what point will additional charges be incurred, and that will, of course, be influenced by the previous discussion of the economic group, I'm sure, and also price. And what is, how much is the service cost? There are a number of items which are still under discussion. We haven't come to agreement on exactly yet, but I wanted to present them and so you can kind of see what we're kind of not agreeing on necessarily, as well as what's currently evaluating. Pricing is a sensitive topic. Or difficult topic because the question, some of the fundamental questions is when do you actually calculate the price? How do you calculate the price? Is it a instantaneous price of a day or is it a running average? It is affected by the second item here, which is bundling. Many, in fact, actually most providers that I've seen bundle services to some extent. For example, you'll get a certain bandwidth or speed, but also there'll be a certain number of email accounts. There'll be web services, a web server hosting, a certain number of gigabytes of web server hosting available. And there may be other innovative services that are bundled in with the whole package, so that it's not just a raw bandwidth, in and up and down. There's also other items that are included. And then there's also bundles such as, if you use our broadband internet service along with mobile wireless and other and video, then there may be a different pricing scheme, that comes along with that type of bundle. But even within a straight broadband internet bundle with no other services like mobile wireless and video involved, there are still internet-related services that are bundled into that as well. The other one is methodology. One, for example, frequency of reporting. How often does the internet provider, update the label? How often does it report? I think we've more or less settled on self-reporting. We had a discussion on, how should the measurements be done, who should do them. I think we've kind of settled for now on self-reporting of the internet providers, of the characteristics. There is some discussion in the future, perhaps moving to measurements based on IETF RFCs, when those might be available. Other factors that we've, dealt with in terms of a simple label program that, isn't covered by a simple label program are things like customer service, and then related to that are ease of use, setup time for the service, and then other performance characteristics such as latency, jitter, packet drop, connectivity of the internet provider, and congestion, what otherwise may be known as oversubscription of the service. And those are the items that we're looking at right now. I think we have several members of the Transparency Working Group here that can comment or provide clarifying comments on these items based on what we've discussed. Another item which I left off the view graphs here is that was brought up earlier is variability. One of the difficulties in many of these services is a variability of the upload and download speed. Some technologies such as DSL may have variable speeds based on how the distance from the central office, the quality of the copper, and other items, so that the extra speed may be different if you're 18 kilofeet from the central office as opposed to right next door. Same thing with mobile wireless. I think everyone realizes that, based on the number of people in a particular cell, the distance from the antenna, you might have a different experience. So those are things that can't be captured in a simple label scheme. But it is something we looked at in terms of allowing people to make some comparisons, between providers in a standard way. Thanks, and I'll open it up for comments and clarifications from the other members of the working group. Thanks.
Thank you, Chip. One quick question may be worth just clarifying at the start. Are these labels anticipated for both wireline and wireless providers?
In my understanding of the order, the transparency requirements apply to both mobile broadband and fixed line broadband.
Yes.
So I think that might be something that hasn't been nailed down in the group.
Got
it. Just personally on that, I would like to see. I don't see why not.
Right.
From off the top of my head. Another thing is we'd like to look at the Measuring Broadband America. They are doing measurements, working on measurements. I understand last week they had a interesting presentation from the NC State Practicum for an innovative way of measuring, broadband or reporting it out, different than what's kind of just raw speed and averages.
Yes.
It might be interesting to look at once that's public.
Yes.
Made available, and but also, so we might want to look at that service. But I'm not sure that they have actually come up with a measurements program for mobile wireless yet.
Yes.
I think it's only fixed line, so we might encourage them to look at that as well. Thanks.
And has there been discussion within the group about whether, particularly on the wireless side, where nearly all of the restrictions of the open internet order do not apply, nearly all of them, as to whether there should be some form of self-disclosure of practices that would, were they wireline, say, amount to something covered by the order, given that the exemption of wireless is a kind of wait-and-see exemption?
I'm not aware of it, but I'll be happy to hear from the other members of the group that are here that maybe I missed a call that was on.
On that or any other issue, anybody want to speak?
I'll just make a few comments, Jonathan. I think with respect to where the transparency group has gotten to, to some extent, the consensus around this notion of a nutrition label seems to be, go back to Chip's first or second slide, oriented towards essentially providing a standard way of disclosing information that may enable consumers to make purchase decisions. So, you want to be able to see what provider A is offering versus provider B. And so that seems to be where the group has settled. And to the extent that that information is lacking or hard to find, having some sort of a standardized way of disclosing it could be of value. I think that the devil's in the details a little bit, and part of where we're struggling, I think, is getting down to what extent should we get down into the details of actually how this information should be provided. Some of the details of what is available in terms of upload and download speeds actually depends on the specific address that you live at. So that's a level of detail which is very hard to have a consumer derive any meaningful information from something that's an aggregated piece of data. The other thing where there's been a lot of debate is around price, and certainly when we traditionally think of a nutrition label, price is explicitly not a component of the label, and there are a variety of reasons for that, which we're struggling with here as well. They tend to change. There can be discounts that are applied, 2-for-1 offers and so on, and so that there's a reason why the price is typically on the edge of the shelf in the supermarket rather than on the nutrition label that's printed on the box. And some of the things, just as an example, that we've been struggling with is that there has been discussion of, this price that would be reported, and I'm not exactly sure where or how it's reported, but would be a 3-year running average of data that the ISP provide once a year. So if an approach like that were taken, the published price that was included in the label would actually be significantly out of date with any price that a consumer might pay. And it's really an artificial number that, in fact, no consumer might pay because it's some average that's aggregated over 3 years. And so I would actually argue that, in fact, it could be more confusing than just what the consumer has access to when they go to the ISP's website or when they make a phone call to try to purchase a service. At the point of sale, the consumer does know the price for broadband service. And so, we have to be a little careful not to actually construct this label in a way that actually introduces greater confusion rather than actually simplifying and making it clear as to what the actual price is that the consumer might be paying. So I think that the price is probably the area where we've had most difficulty reaching consensus.
Yeah, it's an interesting metaphor, the supermarket, since the supermarket is an intermediary that literally prices apples to apples and tends on the edge of the shelf to indicate something like this is how much it costs per ounce, which is always interesting when you buy something like Jet Dry for your dishwasher. It's like $2,000 an ounce or something because it's so little. And it sounds like since there's no supermarket for broadband services that does that harmonization at the edge of the shelf, it is more like an open-air bazaar. And I guess you're suggesting that because the changes are so dynamic, it's best to go to the booth and just see what the merchant tells you there.
That's right.
So I have kind of a follow-up question, which is about where the label would live. Because I guess what I was thinking when you were talking about prices is that obviously you advertise the prices, I guess, on your website. Lots of people buy broadband that way. And so you change them all the time on the website. If the label is also on the website, you could change it all the time on the label. But then I understand there's other difficulties and that different people get different prices, and that's a whole other thing. But where does the label live?
I don't think there's a consensus on that. There has been discussion of actually having the label be on the ISP's website. So the benefit of that approach would be, as you say, it can reflect a dynamic price, and also the benefit to the consumer might be that the same information is represented in the same way on one ISP's website as on another ISP's website. So it's a little more transparent, to borrow a word, if they can don't have to search for the information. It's laid out in a similar way. But then there's also been this discussion of having information that is aggregated over a 3-year period and updated once a year, and possibly published on an FCC website, which is, again, to me, makes no sense. And we keep, at this point, we've been back and forth amongst all of these alternatives without actually, I think, converging on the particular communication mechanism that would be used.
I'd like to rebound a little bit on the mobile piece again. That seems to be my common theme today. It seems to me that if you were to try and specify the mobile experience in terms of megabits per second of average throughput, gigabytes we can do, because we add them up at the end of the month. But megabits per second is an instantaneous thing. So I would have to specify it per user, per room in their house, potentially, because that, as we all know, there are spots where you get good coverage and there are spots where you don't. And I'd have to specify it more or less along their life vector, meaning I'd have to tell them what they were going to get when they were in the other places where they spent substantial amounts of time, for it to be meaningful. Meaning, if I spend 60% of the time at home, it may be that in certain rooms of my house I get much better throughput than another, and I'm frustrated by the fact that, in fact, I'd be much better off picking a different provider who provided more coverage in the room of my house where I spend more time. So I think there's a degree where what I'm trying to say is that the average number will be so meaningless as to be misleading, and I think we need to focus, if we think about the broadband piece, the mobile broadband piece, on something that actually would have meaning, as opposed to just be noise, or worse still, misleading, because it wasn't representative of the experience you would have throughout your day.
And what would that something be?
That's what I don't know. But what I would say, though, I mean, it probably is much more related to the types of throughputs that the operator can offer in geographies. But it's a largely unhelpful thing when I make a decision. So I could provide this information, but I wouldn't use it in a buying decision. So I just worry a little bit. Again, somewhat like the QoE, we're going to try and specify something that will actually not be useful. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think we should at least take into account the reality of a mobile experience means that number is very hard to make meaningful. And maybe gigabytes in the end is really the only thing that I know I'm going to get, and I can compare that because it doesn't have that variance of environment. That's just a thought.
I mean, that's something I've wondered about because, Marcus, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but the large mobile providers, like, they don't sell 4G distinctly from 3G, right? Like, you don't buy a service because it's not priced differently if it's 4G or 3G. And that's, as far as I know, the only other indication that you get of speed.
Yeah, you buy the more gigabytes in an LTE plan, you don't buy it because it's LTE.
Right, yeah.
Well, that's true in this country.
Yep.
Right,
Other
yes.
countries have done
Other
that
countries
differently.
different.
Other thoughts on this? David?
I don't know whether you want to go on to public comment. I think there's a significant issue that relates this transparency back to the question of what we were talking about in specialized services, and I don't want to start a long conversation and cut into public comment, but there is actually, I think, a significant issue related to this whole quality of experience thing, and I wanted
Go
some
ahead.
point.
This is a good time.
Okay. So Marcus, I wanted to respond to some of your concern about quality of experience because I want to say it slightly differently, which I think avoids some of your concerns. I am not suggesting that the FCC should go out there and measure quality of experience as an end-to-end, because, as you say, there can be, well, if you take Kevin's number, there's 7 parameters. I'm saying something slightly different, which is that if you measure quality of experience under a controlled circumstance, you can, and people have, come up with a functional relationship that relates the user-reported subjective quality of experience to the underlying parameters of the overall system: packet loss, overall latency, throughput, and so forth. And the proposal that the CSTB put together was a bandwidth service is good enough if it, as opposed to some of the other 6, let's say, is not the limiting factor in the quality of experience.
Fair.
So what I'm suggesting is that you take the data that's being gathered in measuring broadband America, bandwidth, latency, packet drops, and things like that. Those are the technical parameters. And if you put that into the function that relates to quality of experience with respect to a particular application, like watching video, downloading a web page, you can say, if the service as measured by Broadband America is above a certain threshold, then it's not the limit, it must be one of those other 6. So if you're having a problem as a consumer, don't beat the ISP, go beat somebody else. Now, it doesn't mean that you can figure out who it is.
Fair point, David.
But if you think about the issue of labeling, one of the things you find on a nutritional package is not only how many milligrams of vitamin C are in it, but how many you should have. And I think one of the things that quality of experience can bring to the label is to help the consumer understand where, given what they particularly want to do, download movies, cruise the web, whatever it is, when it's good enough.
There is the FCC Need for Speed initiative that isn't we all have a need for speed. It's kind of, what is your need for speed? I think you like do radio buttons and say exactly that.
Well, I don't think most people know, but the point is, I think that the quality of experience as a metric plays 2 roles here. One of them is, in fact, to solve Kevin's problem, which is my system is good enough that if you're having a bad experience, it's somebody else's problem. So don't beat me. And secondly, it's something that could be factored into the label. It also, with respect to a particular application like cruising the web or watching a video, allows you to take the multiple parameters, not just the speed, but the latency and the packet drops and so forth, and roll them up into a single number. And there's an imperfection in this, but as I said, people have studied this. And in the end, the MOS score is when you say to the consumer, how happy are you? And they come up with a number, which is, they don't know about these underlying parameters. They just say, it worked great, it sucked. And so you can, in fact, use this concept of the quality of experience as a way of folding multiple of these technical parameters into a label with respect to a particular use.
So
I want to watch Netflix,
yes,
etc.
Let me try your idea, because I like it in principle. One thing with streaming video, adaptive streaming video, is the TCP parameters more or less determine some of the QoE, the quality of experience. But is that the video streaming server guy's responsibility to set those parameters correctly, and maybe even the client cooperate in that? But that would look like a network effect, I think. So I would say, in that case, I think the network was misbehaving in that measurement, but in fact it was the streaming server that hadn't set its TCP parameters correctly.
Right.
Would I not?
I think that if you have, if you look at something like Sam Knows or Ookla, they try very hard in measuring your access parameters to make sure that they're doing the test using TCPs that are properly parameterized. They got the receive windows and all that kind of crap right. So that what they tell you is this is what you should get if, in fact, the server and the end node are configured properly. And again, if you have a very bad user experience compared to what those tools tell you, you don't know whether it's the server or your client, although I can tell you how to figure that out, but it's not the network. And so if in fact you as a consumer are not getting what you think you should relative to the label, what we're getting at here is a way of saying, don't call your ISP. Now, in fact, if everybody has the same experience from the server, and this is something that can be measured because you should put labels, as we talked earlier in this issue about should applications have labels. In fact, the application guys pretty quickly figure out that their server's misconfigured. It's almost always the sucky system you're running, this out-of-date Windows with a teeny tiny window, receive window size. There are people who actually can run a test that will tell you that's what the problem is. Okay. Most consumers, we haven't explained to consumers how to do that, but there are some Google tests on NDT that will actually tell you that, which is your machine is misconfigured, guys. That's what your problem is. So I think you can tease them apart once you know there's a problem. But we did want to sort of refer this to consideration to the transparency people, because not only does it help you understand what your recommended daily allowance is, as it were, to compare the dose, but it also allows you to come up with a way of folding multiple technical parameters into one number that might be meaningful. But the only way to do that is with respect to an application or a use. Okay.
Just one comment, David, and because I think there's so many issues here, it's useful to try to tease them apart. So we have discussed, and in fact spent quite a bit of time discussing the various possible goals for the transparency logo or label, whatever terminology we use. The specific one that, at least at the moment, the group has settled on is this notion that the label is a way of helping the consumer at time of purchase.
Yeah.
Very different goal from the goal of I'm having a problem with this service right now. Is that due to a performance problem on my ISP's network, or is that due to misconfiguration in the edge provider server? So we've moved away a little bit from the notion of putting forward a proposal that requires real-time measurement of performance, because to a particular subscriber's home, because that achieving that probably is a long-term goal, and the group has been wanting to look at what is possible, as it were, today, and a long-term goal that depends on functionality being incorporated into modems or residential gateways using standards that are not yet written by the IETF and the Broadband Forum is probably 5 or more years away. So the measurement-based stuff, while important, we've tended to move away from providing a tool that a subscriber can use to say something about the service they're getting today, and move towards something that is perhaps a simpler goal of helping the consumer, or consumers make purchase decisions.
I understand that, and I'm actually arguing that the quality of experience concept is useful at time of purchase. I mean, Marcus asked a question about, well, what do you do about the fact your machine is misconfigured, and that takes you into another space, but in fact that wasn't a conversation about labeling.
Okay.
What I'm saying is I think when the consumer goes out and he sees a label, one of the questions he's going to say is, well, what's good enough? Yeah. And that is a time of purchase question.
David, it's Brad Burnham. There's one question that I guess I should be addressing to the Transparency Committee, and that is, did this analysis consider the question of what the measured throughput would be in a situation where a carrier had carved out some portion of the access network for specialized services, and therefore it would, affect the delivery of, pure internet services? Or is the Transparency Committee focused on, pure internet services and trying to measure that irrespective to what the access provider has carved out for specialized services?
Chip? So from my perspective, it's focused on the broadband internet access. I think what you call pure internet service. I think that's what it is focused on, and that is what it's focused on, not on what other services might be offered or specialized services might be out there. It's just the broadband internet access service, so people who are looking for that service will be able to see what they're getting, or see at least what the provider is providing for that particular service.
Yes, so to add to the complexity of the measurement problem, is the model that David proposed for measuring kind of a generic throughput, not down to the specific house, distance from the central office and that sort of thing, would that also include, would there be any way to include the impact of the access provider setting aside some logical bandwidth for specialized services. So if I, or is there any way to include that in the measurement or in the labeling?
Dave Clark, let me try answering that. As we said in the discussion of specialized service, one of the interesting questions that comes up, and you have to look at it on a service-by-service basis, is whether the capacity that has been set aside for the specialized service is in addition to the promised bandwidth that you get when you buy the public internet service. And we felt as a committee that if in fact the specialized service was sharing the capacity that you'd bought, that actually raised a question of whether it was truly a specialized service, which is why we were adding this capacity isolation parameter to the space of defining a specialized service. If you look, for example, at some of the specific cases that came up today, like the set-top box specialized services, those are giving you additional capacity, and if they operate as advertised, you shouldn't see a degradation in your internet throughput while you are using one of those specialized services. Clearly, what Measuring Broadband America does today is measure your internet service, and if in fact that's impaired by some other specialized service, that would show up as a variation in the measurement, but they don't measure the specialized service. Does that make sense? Yeah, I'm getting a, Kevin says yeah. So
it's really an indirect measurement, right? So the really what Measuring Broadband America is, and a lot of internet measurements are measuring your internet service. And if your internet service is being fulfilled and you're getting what's being advertised, it's an indirect measurement of if there are other things that are potentially impacting it.
I think I want to say the same thing in slightly different words because I think it's an important point to really drive home. It's not a measurement of your IP services. Right. It's a measurement of your internet access, period.
Right. And that's really the only thing that the FCC is in a position to measure, unless they do some really heroic stuff. Specialized services tend to be more vertically integrated. It's not clear you can even put measurement probes into them. I mean, they're bundled things, like watching video on your Xbox.
It's not the width of the tube.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I just mumbled. It's not the width of the tube through which all things are flowing.
Yes, exactly. Right. We're having a violent agreement.
Yes.
Is there, David, just to keep going on this a little bit, is there a sense of simultaneousness in this, which might say that I can validly deliver a video service or over a broadband connection if it's 1 megabit per second, but I can't game and video. So is there a sense of I have to tell them what they can't do, or is that implicitly tell them what they could do if they had a higher tier?
Yeah, I don't know how to roll that into a label. I understand what you're saying, but
now again, in the food industry,
clearly
they
are
don't
some
tell you
households.
what else you should have bought.
right. I mean, there clearly are some households that have to deal with this problem. Their kids doing application A and their
Yes.
parents trying to do application B, and they get grumped out because they interfere with each other.
Exactly.
And yeah, I don't know what to say about that.
Any other comments on this? So that finishes the presentation part of this meeting. We had allocated time for public comment. The C-SPAN-like configuration of the room suggests very strongly to me that unless Elijah turns up, we don't have public comment.
Is there somebody online? Or?
Well, there are folks online, but we have traditionally not had a means of incorporating comment that way.
Right.
So both for that and for the enduring record we are creating as we speak, there is our FCC liaison and point of contact for public comment to be emailed, and that's Tejas. Tejas, do you want to give your email address for the ages here?
So the email address is actually in the public notice for the meeting, but it's the first name, T-E-J-A-S, dot the last name, N-A-R-E-C-H-A-N-I-A, at fcc.gov, and I'll receive any public comments that way.
Great, and we'll plan to make available the decks that were presented today among the materials on the website for the committee. This has been among the most interim of our sessions with respect to the state at which each working group is in its own deliberations and work. That work will be, I think, meant to be wrapped up by our annual final meeting for this term in Washington in July. The date we have set for it, though not formally put in stone yet, is July 10th in Washington, and there may be some opportunity. We'll do another poll to see what kind of quorum we have at that date. My understanding is that the fact that there will be a turnover in leadership at the commission, a new chairman, by way of an interim chairman too, will not affect the existence of this group. It will continue. And we should then aim to have a final product of some kind, perhaps ready to be voted upon by that final meeting in July. So we'll circulate within the committee mailing list a rough outline of how we expect that'll happen. My guess is it will be largely drawing from the work of the working groups, both that which has come before and that which is coming in for a landing between now and July, along with some synthetic work meant to make the document of our annual report kind of sing as a whole. So that's what we would take up in July, and I also imagine that would be a really good time to be considering a reconfiguration of our working groups, whether or not these 4 groups are the right ones. Membership can be also reconfigured among the groups. And my guess is, too, we'll want to take up as a committee the extent to which what we're doing should be focused on sort of the longer-term issues, or potentially even the shorter-term ones, such as, for example, the mobile groups look at the AT&T FaceTime situation on a fairly aggressive timeline, or maybe some combination of the two. So that's sort of my thinking for what will happen between now and July and what we'll do when we convene in July. Are there any questions on any of that, or statements, or anything anybody wants to say before we adjourn as a committee in this public meeting? Okay, I see none here. And that being the case, then, just one logistical note. I know the working groups will be meeting this afternoon several buildings down. Given the timing, I think we might see if we can, if there's no objection, slide the schedule to be 30 minutes earlier on all fronts, especially if it turns out lunch is ready earlier. So, and I'm getting a thumbs up from Derek, who says lunch is there. And especially if there's mayonnaise involved, I think this is actually a health and safety issue to move it 30 minutes earlier. Speaking of food labeling. So we just owe thanks to Northwestern, to Medill, and to Derek and Shane for being our hosts here in Chicago, to the working group chairs and members who have been doing the lion's share of what will become the final work of the committee, and the Searle Center as well for providing the rooms and some of the logistics. So with that, I declare us adjourned, and we'll see you all in July. Thank you.